Paying the Land, a graphic novel written by Joe Sacco, revolves around an indigenous group who resides in the Northwest Territories named the Dean. This book focuses on the impact of colonialism on the Dean and their current struggles with matters such as resource extraction. Instead of a streamlined narrative, Paying the Land presents the different perspectives of the Dean through the author's various interviews and interactions with multiple members of different indigenous communities. In Chapter 1, we are introduced to an unnamed man, a member of the Dean community, who recounts his experiences with the Dean as a child. This chapter primarily provides the reader with an idea of how Dean traditionally lived, including their values, beliefs, and practices. In the following chapter, we are introduced to the problem of resource extraction, and more specifically fracking, a process of extracting oil by injecting toxic chemicals into the earth. Fracking is accepted by some. These groups believe that oil is always going to be there, and since the indigenous have no use, they might as well frack it. The opposition concerns that they don't know what the chemicals are going to do to the environment. Chapter 3 presents us with the idea of indigenous land and rights. The chapter first shows us how in the past, the Dean had signed away their rights in land in a contract named Treaty 11. The page then shifts focus to Stephen Cackfoy and his journey to becoming Northwest Territories Premier. In Chapter 4, rather than discussing the present, the book takes us back in time to residential schools and tells us the stories through the lenses of survivors. It explores the horrors of what goes on inside residential schools, as well as its effect on survivors and indigenous communities as a whole. Naturally, in the next chapter, the book will focus on the lasting effects of residential schools in the present, such as drug abuse, alcohol dependency in indigenous communities, which has led to a lack of motivation and work ethic in young teenage years of the community. Finally, in Chapter 6, it introduces us to a new character part of a group called the Dean Najo, who are a modern-day indigenous activist group. The goal of this group is to try to connect with their culture and fill the generational gap left by residential schools. They try to heal their community and learn indigenous languages and practices to keep their culture alive. Paying the Land is told through multiple individuals recounting and sharing their experiences, so consequently the setting is sporadic and constantly changing. The location is constant, Northwest Territories, but the time period is constantly shifting from the past to the present, namely during the residential school period to the current 21st century. To start, the author makes a couple interesting technical choices to denote which time period the reader is in. The author effectively utilizes props in each panel to signal the current time period. We can see a comparison of page 70 and 130 where we can clearly distinguish the time periods. We get a sense that page 70 is more recent from the choices of attire, casual jeans and shirts, and the glasses worn by the older individual. On page 130, we see a more traditional clothes and garbs worn by children and adults. Not only does the character style hint to the time period, props are also used. We can clearly see pretty modern log cabinets in the background on page 70, as compared to the old-fashioned tints on page 130. The author also uses space and settings to depict its central topics, the notable one being land. On page 18, the reader catches a glimpse of the vast horizon and mountains in this distance, which almost makes the people in the panel look insignificant in terms of scale. This fits to the idea of Dean's relationship with the land, how the land owns them and not the other way around. The grandness of the environment is not constrained in the panel, even furthering its greatness and its role in owning the Dean. On page 49, however, we see a huge piece of machinery which occupies half the panel and acts as a type of foil to page 18. The author had purposely beefed up the size and complexity of the pipes to emphasize the point and destructiveness of fracking in indigenous communities. In this panel, the background acts as the negative space to emphasize the pipes in what it symbolizes, the stealing of indigenous space and identity. This book is dedicated to exploring a variety of indigenous issues from different perspectives and examining their effects and causes, but focuses a substantial amount of time on substance dependence, spiraling into a generational cycle of abuse. The cycle is illustrated on page 119, where an individual is recounting his childhood experiences with alcohol. It starts with his father, who is shown to be constantly abusive in the household. Through the gutter, it immediately transitions into his siblings also drinking and partaking in abusive behavior, which in turn spreads to him. In the following pages, we see how, as he grows up, his abusive behaviors also started manifesting in his relationships with his wife and son. This cycle has been named as the transference of dysfunction. This book also focuses on the serious effects of generational abuse on indigenous communities. The first case is the repercussions of substance dependence and abuse on the children. On page 124, this dialogue is especially shocking for the reader as the child is preparing to get blackout drunk, not to be rebellious or to have fun, but to cope with his abuse. This later translates to the path of substance dependence and abuse for the child. In addition, the author explores the actual root of this problem, residential schools. Almost all residential school students have sustained some form of trauma from their experiences, and a lot of people had turned towards alcohol as a means to cope. Trauma is not the only effect of residential schools on indigenous children. Students usually stay at residential schools for 9 months a year for 7 years. For the unlucky few whose family can't afford plane tickets, They are forced to stay in residential schools all year round. A lack of communication and time spent with a child's indigenous families and communities turns into a loss of connection between them. On page 157 and 158, we see how a returning residential school student doesn't really fit in with the community. He isn't accepted as part of the community and instead viewed as an outsider because of his inability and lack of knowledge for traditional indigenous practices. On page 181, we can see how this turns into people punishing themselves with alcohol for losing connection and also being outcast by the community. On the top, we first see a panel of a person being interviewed in the present. This is actually a typical panel in the book where the author draws the interviewee in a black background. The noticeable difference in this frame, however, is that the person is more zoomed in than the previous panels of him, putting him more in focus. This magnifies the importance of his experience in residential schools. We see another example of this in the same panel, where some of the splash actually creeps into and spill into the panel, creating a sense that the scene is being engulfed, that the scene is engulfing the interview. This shows how the memories of residential schools still occupy his mind, and he's still being tormented by the trauma. The most noticeable feature of this page is the splash, the portrayal of hell, acting as a visual metaphor for what the students went through. We should first talk about the texture of how the children are being drawn. We can see little droplets on their skin, giving us a sense that they're melting, which fits with the purpose of reinventing them into the residential school's image. Residential schools are a hell where they melt and break down indigenous identity of these children, so they can reshape and assimilate them back into a more civilized society. In addition, we can see that the only other form of life are the birds who are keeping the children in, and only adding to the pain and suffering. The birds could only represent the priests and nuns who tortured the students at the residential schools. In Christianity, birds also symbolize the duality of good and evil, and the desirable and sinful traits of a person. Since the birds are burning, the author is trying to symbolize that the birds, or priests, were sinful and evil towards indigenous students. The last noticeable feature of this splash is right in the background, just out of focus. We see some figures desperately trying to crawl out of this hell, showing how there were escape attempts from residential schools. However, the bird is keeping them inside, showing that the priests always have a way of keeping the students at the residential schools. The second last panel at the bottom shows us a close-up of the children praying. We see the strain and the state of worry on their faces, like they're desperately praying so they don't end up in hell. This contradicts the very nature of praying in Christianity. Praying in any religion is supposed to be serene and a way to let go of your stress, but the exact opposite of here is shown here, indicating that the residential schools were torturous and their purpose of spreading the word of God is faulted. Finally, the last panel is a zoom out of the previous panel. This panel dramatically changed the tone of the page. The background is dark and smooth, contrary to the raging flames and chaos in the previous panels. This highlights that the previous panels were just a metaphor, but the conditions and experiences were so bad that hell is what residential schools felt like for the students.